Chapter 9. The Detective. The gang sat glumly until George broke the silence. I'm sure it's all connected. The message from the magic lantern, old Miss Gilchrist's murder, and... He paused, staring sadly at the stove. And Tam's, he added softly. The boys seemed to think about this for a while, then Sandy piped up. Maybe we should go to Miss Gilchrist then, she suggested. The others looked at her puzzled, then Jimmy's eyes lit up. Aye, Nellie will be there, he said. The boys nodded. And we can tell her about Sam. She probably doesn't know anything about his... Andrew's voice trailed away, unable to say the word murder. Why would Nellie be there? Sandy asked. She lived there with Miss Gilchrist. She's been with the old lady since she was away. Where else would she go? Jimmy replied. Sandy felt a little disturbed at the thought of spending the night in a house where there had so recently been a murder, and couldn't believe that anybody would be allowed to. I was actually thinking we could go up and investigate the crime scene, you know, like CSIs. The boys looked at her blankly. Don't you have CSIs? She asked. C.S. Whitnow? Said Charlie. Crime scene investigators, Sandy explained, answering their vacant expressions. You know, they go into crime scenes and find all the forensic evidence which tells them who did the crime. Sandy was a big fan of detective programmes and CSI was her favourite. She watched it with her gran. George stared at Sandy with a look of pure astonishment on his face. What's forensic evidence? He asked. All sorts of stuff, you know, hair, blood, fingernails. They find all these bits of stuff lying around and collect them, then analyse it with microscopes and stuff, you know. Like if a murderer cut himself and they found his blood at the scene of the crime, then they can match the blood to the suspect. I don't know exactly how, I'm not a CSI, but that's what they do. George and the others continued to look at her bewildered. How could hair, blood and fingernails tell the police who a murderer was? Do you mean like fingerprints? Asked George, who had read about fingerprints in a paper called The Police Budget, and knew that everyone's fingerprint was different, and detectives could use them to identify suspects. Exactly like fingerprints, said Sandy. Do you think we'll find stuff like that where they found Tam? Asked Andrew. Maybe, replied Sandy. Guess there's no harm in looking, but we're not going to get near it while those crowds are out there. We might find something in Miss Gilchrist, though. Do you really think that whoever done the old lady in did in Tam too? Stands to reason, said George, taking off his glasses and cleaning the lenses on the frayed edge of his ragged coat. He must have seen the murderer when he was in the West End, and they followed him back here. Sandy's right. We might find some forensics at the old lady's house. You all agreed, and save for George, who knew he wouldn't manage the long walk to the West End, Sandy and the boys left the music hall and headed to Miss Gilchrist's. An hour later, Sandy, Andrew, Jimmy, Sam and Charlie were standing in West Princes Street, gazing up at the gaslit window of Miss Gilchrist's apartment. They were frozen to the bone after their trek through the howling wind and freezing sleet. The light went out, and a few moments later a door opened and a gentleman in a bowler hat, black woolen coat and carrying a black umbrella came down the front steps towards them. He stared at them as he reached the last step and said, "Looking for something, boys?" "What's it to use?" Sam replied. The man regarded Sam and smiled. "Well, young man, as you probably know, this house here," he indicated the building behind him with his umbrella, "is the site of a rather gruesome murder, and I am the detective in charge of the investigation. So, boys, what is your reason for being here on this cold night?" "We're looking for our friend Nellie," mumbled Jimmy, looking down at his feet. "Speak up, boy," said the man. "I can't hear you over this wind." "We're looking for Nellie," supplied Charlie, somewhat louder than his quiet friend. "Nellie? The maid? She's not here, son. She's with Miss Gilchrist's niece in Hill Street. What business is she of yours?" "She's stepping out with our friend's brother, sir. We've come to tell her that he's He's been found dead, Sam said awkwardly. Murdered, he added, and stared up at the man in the bowler hat and black wool coat. Oh, said the detective. I'm very sorry to hear that, but like I said, Nellie is not here. He pushed up his umbrella against the sleet and wind. So I suggest you pop off to your homes. The boys didn't move and continued to block his path. They stared up at him with big, sad eyes. He felt sorry for the poor little wretches out here in the cold night. The least he could do was listen to their story of their murdered friend. Maybe he could even help them. How was your friend murdered? He asked. Tam. His name was Tam, Andrew bitterly replied. Yes, sorry. How was Tam murdered? The detective asked. He was stabbed, answered Charlie. Aye, and we think his murderer had something to do with the old woman's murder? Asked Sam. Stabbed, you say? The policeman pondered. The boys nodded. Well, the old lady was bludgeoned, so I don't think the two deaths are connected, well, except for them both knowing Nellie. How was your friend murdered? The Panopticon, chimed Sam and Charlie in unison. In the East End? The gang nodded. The detective harumphed. Well, there you go, opposite ends of the city. Even more reason to surmise that the two murders are in fact not connected. Now, if you don't mind, gentlemen, I would like to go home now and have my tea, and I strongly suggest that you do the same. But the boys did not budge. It was obvious they had made the long trek there on foot in their tattered rags and worn-out boots. Except for the boy in a strange costume, he regarded the boy in the furry boots and strange coat. He must have been a performer at the Panopticon, he thought. He sighed and resigned himself to the fact that his dinner would be cold by the time he got home, as he had to hear these lads out. They all looked dismally cold and wet. This boy, Tam, do you know if he saw Nellie last night before Miss Gilchrist's murder? The detective asked. Aye, the gang replied together. Then I think we should get out of this weather and talk about this a bit further, he said. The boys followed the detective up the steps and into the tenement building. They entered the old lady's flat and the detective lit the gas jets with a long match and led them into the dining room. Without a fire in the hearth, the apartment was cold, but at least it was out of the bitter wind and sleet. The room was exactly as the newspapers had described it. It was grandly furnished and decorated with expensive ornaments and paintings, and although the body of Miss Gilchrist had been removed, her blood was still vivid on the hearthrug and up the wall next to the fireplace. Sandy couldn't help but stare at the stains that were less than 24 hours old. All right, said the policeman as he pulled a small notebook and pencil out of his coat pocket. Tell me about Tam. George saw him with Nellie outside the newsagent's around the corner last night at about 6:30, said Andrew, speaking on behalf of his brother. Which one of you is George? The detective asked. He's not here. We left him back at the Panopticon. He's my wee brother, Andrew replied. And the last time we saw Tam was in the Panopticon. He was working the magic lantern at the 7:30 show, Sam explained sadly. Do you think that Tam could have had something to do with the murder of Miss Gilchrist? The detective asked. The boy shrugged. I don't know, sir, said Sam. I know he didn't murder the old lady. Tam ain't that kind of person. But maybe he saw something after he left Nellie last night and the murderer followed him back to the Panopticon. Did any of you speak to Tam last night? The boys all shook their heads, all except the strangely dressed boy who stared at the bloodstains as if transfixed by them. Can I ask a question? Sandy inquired tentatively. Aye, son. I don't know if I'll be allowed to answer it, but there's no harm in asking. In the newspaper today it said that Nellie and the man who lives downstairs saw a man in a pale-coloured overcoat. Yes, and? The article didn't mention a blood-splattered overcoat All that blood on the wall and rug. Surely if the man in the overcoat was the murderer, wouldn't he have been covered in blood? How could the blood have splashed up the wall and fireplace and not covered him? The detective was taken aback by the boy's comment. The lad was extremely bright, strangely dressed, yes, but bright. Young man, would you, by any chance, want to be a detective? I hope you are considering a life on the force. We think that 2 men were involved. The man Nellie and Mr. Adams encountered in the hallway had come from Miss Gilchrist's bedroom, not this room. We believe the murderer climbed out of the window over there and lowered himself into the back court before making his escape via the back lane. But the papers only mention 1 man. They don't say anything about 2, said Charlie, and the other boys nodded in agreement. Well, we aren't obliged to tell the papers everything. We keep certain information away from the public, especially in cases like these when we rely on reports from the members of the public. We want to make sure that what people tell us isn't what they read in the papers. Have any of you seen Nellie recently? Yes, sir, last Thursday, when she came into the Panopticon to see Tam, answered Charlie. She always comes to see Tam on her day off. Has Nellie said anything to you at all about any strangers watching the house or anything suspicious at any time? The boys thought hard for a moment, trying to remember any recent conversations any of them had had with Nellie. Last time she'd been in the Panopticon, Jamie had been telling her all about the phantom pickpocket. They hadn't really talked about anything else, though Nellie had mentioned that her knees and back were sore from having to crawl under Miss Gilchrist's bed. Come to think of it, she did say that Miss Gilchrist had made a check under the bed because she thought someone was hiding under it, Sam supplied. The detective raised an eyebrow and jotted a note. Interesting. Well, I will call the Carlton office and ask them to send an officer to talk to you just in case you remember anything that might be relevant to the case. I assume you all have addresses? Aye, sir, answered Andrew. Most of us are at the Goose Stubbs and Backwind. Sam lives on the Trongate. But most of the time you can find us in the Panopticon. The detective sat back in his seat and reviewed his notes, then sat forward again and asked, Where did Tam live? The boys all replied together, Panopticon. The detective closed his book, put it and his pencil back in his coat pocket and stood up. Well, lads, if that's all the information you have for me just now, I suggest you go home for your tea and I'll go home for mine before it gets spoiled and Mrs. Trench goes on the warpath. Here's my card. He handed the card to Andrew. Contact me at the West End Police Office if you think of anything else, and here's £50 to share for your information, he said, dropping the coin in Charlie's upturned palm. Sam, who watched the coin as it dropped into his friend's hand, suddenly asked, Do you know who AB is? How did he know about AB? The detective thought. No, I don't know who AB is. It wasn't a lie. He didn't know exactly who AB was, but the initials were believed to be connected to the murder. Why do you ask? He just saw it written somewhere, that's all, Jimmy said, and started to shove his small friend with the big mouth out of the door before he said something else that would be difficult to explain to an adult, especially a policeman. The detective watched the small raggle-taggle gang of newsboys and urchins as they hurried off down the street, huddled together against the bitter wind. The sleet had become soft flakes of wet snow that settled on their thin shoulders. The detective felt a pang of pity for them. How did they know about AB? How could they know? What were these boys hiding? And there was something else, the boy in the fur boots. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was definitely something suspicious about him. He'd have to keep an eye on them, just in case. Well, that is the end of chapter 9. Join us again on Thursday the 1st of August for chapter 10.